They showed me pictures of golden fields and blue skies, images that burned themselves into my mind with the intensity of a dying star. And I believed every single lie they told me, because believing was easier than accepting that my life in the underhive of Crucian Prime would never be anything more than slow suffocation in recycled air that tasted of rust and despair. The recruitment vidcards played on a loop in the communal area of Hab Block 77 Theta, their holographic projections casting false light across faces that had forgotten what real sunlight looked like. And I watched them with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a rope that might be made of razor wire, but at least offered the promise of something different from the daily grind of factory work and gang violence and the ever-present knowledge that death would come early and without meaning. The images were beautiful in a way that felt almost obscene. Rolling plains of wheat that swayed in gentle breezes, workers with honest sweat on their faces rather than the chemical residue that coated our skin after every shift in the Prometheum refineries. Hab blocks that stood in open air instead of being crushed under kilometers of industrial superstructure, and above it all, the promise repeated in Gothic script that glowed with artificial warmth. Feed the Imperium, serve the God Emperor, live under open skies. I was 23 standard years old, which meant I had already outlived most of my generation in the underhive, and I had nothing to lose except a life that was barely worth living in the first place. My parents had died in a collapse of Habby Section 12 when I was 14. Crushed under tons of corroded metal that gave way because the maintenance schedule had been ignored for 3 decades in favor of increasing production quotas. And I had survived by learning to keep my head down, work my shifts without complaint, and avoid the gangs that controlled every aspect of life below the smog line. But survival is not the same as living, and every day I spent breathing toxic air and eating corpse starch that tasted like decay was another day where I felt pieces of myself eroding away like the metal girders that held up our crumbling world. The recruitment officer came through once every 6 months, a man with augmetic eyes and a voice that had been modified to carry authority and reassurance in equal measure. And he spoke of opportunity and service and the pride of feeding billions of faithful Imperial citizens across the sector. He never mentioned the details, never explained what exactly we would be doing on these agri-worlds, but he did not need to because we filled in the gaps with our own desperate fantasies. I imagined working in fields where I could see the sky, eating food that had not been processed through industrial recycling systems, sleeping in quarters where the air did not carry the constant smell of chemical death. I imagined a life where my labor had meaning beyond simply surviving until the next shift. I imagined escape from the grinding machinery of the underhive. That imagination was enough to make me volunteer when they called for workers willing to relocate to Agri-World Torvandis 7 in the Gehenna subsector. They processed 200 of us through medical screening that was perfunctory at best, checking only that we had working limbs and functional organs, not caring about the lung damage from years of breathing toxic air or the malnutrition that had stunted our growth. And within 3 days, we were loaded onto a bulk transport hauler that had seen better centuries and was now reduced to moving human cargo across the void. The journey took 6 weeks, and those weeks taught me more about suffering than my entire life in the underhive had managed to convey. We were packed into cargo holds that had been retrofitted with minimal life support, sleeping in bunks that were stacked 5 high and spaced so close that you could smell the fear and desperation of your neighbors with every breath. The air was recycled to the point where it felt like breathing paste, thick and warm and carrying the accumulated stench of hundreds of unwashed bodies confined in spaces never meant for human habitation. Food came twice daily, delivered by servitors whose blank faces and mechanical movements reminded us of what awaited anyone who failed to serve the Imperium with sufficient enthusiasm, and consisted of nutrient paste that had no flavor beyond vaguely organic and was dispensed from tubes that looked like they belonged in waste processing rather than food distribution. But we ate it without complaint because it was still better than corpse starch. Or at least that is what we told ourselves as we swallowed mouthfuls that threatened to come back up with every movement of the ship through the warp. The other workers came from across the sector, and their stories all carried the same weight of desperation dressed in different details. A woman named Alera had fled a forge world where her hab block had been scheduled for demolition to make room for expanded munitions production, and she had chosen relocation over becoming another statistic in the Administratum's casualty reports. A man who called himself Torve had been conscripted into the Imperial Guard but had failed the physical requirements due to a childhood injury that left him with a limp, and rather than face execution for wasting the Imperium's resources on failed processing, he had accepted assignment to agricultural labor. Others had committed minor crimes, questioned the wrong official, or simply existed in places where population reduction had become a priority. And all of us shared the same desperate hope that whatever awaited us on Torvandis 7th would be better than what we were leaving behind. An old man with scars that told stories of violence survived through luck rather than skill, told us about Grox during the long dark hours when sleep would not come, and the ship's engines thrummed through the hull with a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. He had worked on an agri-world decades before, or so he claimed, though his memories had the quality of trauma filtered through time and might have been distorted by whatever experiences had followed. He spoke of massive reptilian creatures that stood taller than a man and weighed more than small vehicles, of beasts that had been lobotomized to make them manageable but still killed workers with casual violence, of breeding bulls kept in maximum security pens because their rage and intelligence made them too dangerous for normal handling. He described the smell, the noise, the constant danger, and the way workers died in accidents that were recorded in ledgers, but never prevented because human life was cheaper than the equipment needed for proper safety measures. His warnings carried weight because he had survived, though his missing fingers and the way he flinched at sudden sounds suggested that survival had come, with costs that numbers in a report could never capture. I listened and told myself he was exaggerating, that his memories had been twisted by time and trauma into something worse than reality, that the recruitment materials could not all be lies because the Imperium needed workers, and destroying potential labor with false promises served no practical purpose. I was wrong about all of it, but I would not understand that until I stepped off the transport onto the surface of Torvandis 7 and smelled the air for the first time. The descent through the atmosphere took 2 hours, and through the few viewports available in the cargo holds, we caught our first glimpses of the world that would become our prison. From orbit, Torvandis 7th looked almost beautiful, a world of muted greens and browns with no visible oceans but vast stretches of what might have been agricultural land. And we pressed against the viewports like children seeing something wonderful for the first time, our imaginations still clinging to the propaganda that had brought us here. As we descended lower, the truth began to assert itself in ways that our desperate optimism could not ignore. The green we had seen was not natural vegetation, but genetically modified super wheat that grew in endless monoculture plains, fields that stretched from horizon to horizon without variation or break. And the brown was not soil, but the chemical-stained earth that had been so thoroughly processed and fertilized that it had lost any connection to organic life. The sky was not the blue of the recruitment images, but a sickly yellow-gray that spoke of atmospheric processing and industrial pollutants. And even through the hull of the transport, we could see clouds that moved in patterns suggesting chemical saturation rather than natural weather systems. The transport landed at a processing facility that looked more like a military installation than anything agricultural. All reinforced ferrocrete walls and automated defense systems, and as the cargo ramps descended and we filed out into the light of day for the first time in weeks, the smell hit us with physical force that made several people double over and vomit onto the loading platform. It was a smell beyond simple description, a mixture of ammonia and decay and predator musk that had been concentrated and amplified until it became something that assaulted not just the nose, but the entire respiratory system, burning the throat and making the eyes water and penetrating through clothing and skin to lodge itself in places you did not know existed. The air itself was thick and wrong, carrying a chemical tang that made breathing feel like work. And within minutes, my lungs were burning with an intensity that made the underhive's polluted atmosphere feel clean by comparison. The temperature was oppressive, not the natural heat of a sun on open plains, but the accumulated warmth of billions of tons of living flesh packed into facilities designed for efficiency rather than comfort, and sweat began to pour from my body before I had taken 10 steps from the transport. Overseer Calix met us on the loading platform, though meeting might be too generous a word for what was closer to processing inventory than greeting workers, and one look at him told me everything I needed to know about the place I'd volunteered to come to. He had once been human, or at least had started as human before the Adeptus Mechanicus had gotten their augmetic hands on him, and now he was something in between, a hybrid of flesh and machine that moved with mechanical precision, while his few remaining organic parts expressed the kind of cold disdain that comes from viewing other humans as nothing more than components in a larger system. His right arm was entirely mechanical, ending in a hand that could probably crush a man's skull without effort, and his left eye had been replaced with an optical augmetic that whirred and clicked as it focused on each of us in turn, cataloging and assessing our worth with calculations that were probably being fed directly to some data system that would determine our assignments and projected lifespan. When he spoke, his voice came through a Vox grill implanted in his throat, mechanical and emotionless, stripping away any trace of human warmth or compassion. He explained that we had been assigned to Grox-Herding Facility 77 Omega, one of 16,000 such facilities spread across Torvandis 7's surface, and that our duty was to serve the God Emperor by maintaining the livestock that fed the Imperium's billions. He spoke of quotas and production schedules and the importance of efficiency, and he explained with the same clinical detachment one might use to describe machinery maintenance that the average worker lasted 3.7 years in Grox-Herding operations, and that this was considered acceptable waste in service of the greater imperial good. He told us that escape was impossible, that the entire planet was monitored by orbital stations and automated defense systems, and that attempting to flee would result in immediate termination, followed by processing into Grox feed. And he said this without any hint of threat in his mechanical voice, because it was simply fact, as immutable as gravity or death. Then he had servitors distribute our equipment, thick leather coats that had been treated with chemicals to resist Grox bites, heavy boots with reinforced steel toes, breathing masks that would filter out some but not all of the toxic air, electroprods that crackled with blue energy when activated, and identification tags that bore our names, and a number that I would later learn represented our assigned work detail. My number was 77 Omega 3 892. And within a week, I would respond to that number faster than I would respond to my own name, because names were for humans, and we were being trained to think of ourselves as components in a machine rather than individuals with identity and worth. The first sight of the Grox pens came as we were marched from the processing facility across half a kilometer of bare dirt that had been compressed by decades of heavy vehicle traffic until it had the consistency of ferrocrete. And even from that distance, the sound of them reached us like the growl of some massive predator that was just waking up and remembering its hunger. It started as a low rumble that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears, a collective noise produced by thousands of reptilian throats, all bellowing and grunting and hissing in a cacophony that never stopped, not for day or night or any consideration of those forced to work nearby. And as we got closer, that rumble resolved itself into individual sounds that were somehow worse than the collective mass, because they allowed you to imagine the creatures making them. The pens themselves were industrial structures that stretched across hectares of land, massive reinforced barriers that rose 3 meters high and were topped with electrified fencing that hummed with lethal current. And behind those barriers, we could see movement, massive shapes that were reptilian and wrong in ways that my mind struggled to process, because nothing in nature should be that large and that aggressive and still be classified as livestock. The first Grox I saw clearly was a lobotomized male that had been brought to the outer pen for medical inspection, and even diminished by surgical mutilation, it was terrifying in a way that went beyond rational fear and touched something primal that existed in the human hindbrain from when our ancestors were prey rather than predators. It stood nearly 5 meters long from snout to tail, its body covered in overlapping scales that looked thick enough to turn aside a blade and were colored a mottled gray-green that would have provided camouflage in jungle environments, but here just looked like diseased stone. Its legs were thick pillars of muscle that ended in clawed feet designed for tearing and gripping, and its tail was a muscular appendage that lashed back and forth with enough force to shatter bones if it connected with a human body. The head was the worst part, a massive blocky skull that seemed too large for even that huge body, with jaws that could open wide enough to bite a man in half and were lined with teeth that interlocked like the gears of some biological machine designed for rending flesh. Where its eyes should have shown intelligence or at least animal awareness, there was only blank mechanical reaction, the result of the lobotomization that had destroyed its frontal cortex and left it operating on pure instinct and territorial rage. Even sedated and restrained, even with its brain partially destroyed and its body constrained by chains thick enough to moor a ship, it still radiated danger and predatory threat, and watching it, I understood for the first time that the old man's warnings had not been exaggerations, but if anything had failed to capture the full horror of what we would be working with daily. Overseer Calix informed us, without any trace of emotion, that the lobotomized specimens were the safe ones, the manageable livestock that could be herded and fed and eventually processed without excessive risk to human handlers, and that the real danger came from the breeding stock that had to maintain full cognitive function to ensure proper mating behaviors. These breeding groks were kept in separate maximum security facilities that we would only enter under strict protocols and with full protective equipment, and even then workers died regularly, because no amount of preparation could fully account for the intelligence and rage of a creature that had evolved as an apex predator and had been given just enough awareness to understand its captivity and hate everything responsible for it. Training lasted 1 week, and by the end of that week, 3 members of our intake group were dead, and 5 more had been reassigned to lighter duties after injuries that rendered them incapable of working directly with the Grox. And those of us who remained had learned to move with the hypervigilance of soldiers in a combat zone, because that is essentially what we had become. Combatants in a war where one side consisted of massive reptilian murder machines and the other side consisted of poorly equipped humans armed with sticks that shocked, and an institutional indifference to whether we lived or died. My training supervisor was a man named Merrick who had worked Grox pens for 20 years, which made him a legend among the workers and an anomaly in the statistics, and his body told the story of that survival in scars that covered every visible piece of skin and spoke of encounters where luck rather than skill had been the difference between life and death. He was missing 2 fingers on his left hand, courtesy of a breeding bull that had gotten its jaws around his grip on a control gate, and his right leg had been reconstructed with crude augmetics after a trampling incident that should have killed him, but instead just left him with a limp and chronic pain that he never acknowledged, except in the way he moved when he thought no one was watching. Merrick taught us the basics of Grox handling with the patient efficiency of someone who had explained the same things hundreds of times to workers who would mostly be dead within a year, and he did not waste time on false comfort or gentle encouragement, but instead focused on practical information that might keep us alive long enough to become useful. He explained that lobotomized Grox operated on pure instinct and territorial response, meaning they would attack anything that registered as a threat or competition, but could be managed through consistent application of electroprod shock and careful positioning that respected their territorial instincts. He showed us how to use the shock gates that divided the pens into manageable sections, demonstrating the timing required to move a group of Grox from feeding area to holding area without triggering the stampede response that could kill workers caught in the wrong position. He taught us to always maintain 2 escape routes in our minds, to never turn our backs on any Grox, even the most docile, lobotomized specimen, and to accept that accidents would happen and that survival was often a matter of random chance rather than skill or preparation. The feeding ritual happened twice daily, at dawn and dusk, and it was during feeding that most accidents occurred because hunger overrode even the dampened instincts of lobotomized Grox and turned them into mindless eating machines that would crush anything between them and food. The feed came from massive industrial hoppers that were filled with a mixture of genetically modified grain, mineral supplements, recycled waste, and processed protein that included the rendered remains of dead Grox and dead workers. Because the Imperium wastes nothing, and efficiency demands that every input be utilized to its maximum potential, regardless of the source. The Grox would eat literally anything that contained organic matter or useful minerals, an adaptation that had made them valuable as livestock in the first place. And watching them feed was like watching a biological garbage disposal system that operated with violence and mechanical efficiency. When the feed was released into the troughs, the Grox would charge forward with enough force to shake the ground, their bodies slamming into each other and into the barriers with impacts that should have caused injury, but barely slowed them down. And the noise they made was unlike anything I had experienced, a combination of bellowing and hissing and the wet sounds of feeding that mixed together into a symphony of appetite that made my stomach turn even as I maintained my position by the shock gate. During my first week, I made the mistake of hesitating when a lobotomized bull charged the gate I was operating, freezing for just a fraction of a second as my hindbrain screamed at me to run, while my training told me to stand firm and apply the shock prod. And that hesitation nearly cost me my life. As the bulls smashed into the barrier with enough force to bend the reinforced metal and send vibrations through my arms that left them numb for hours. Afterward, Merrick saved me by activating his own shock prod and delivering a jolt strong enough to drop the bull and give me time to get my gate fully closed. And afterward, he did not yell or berate me, but simply said that hesitation kills and that I needed to choose right now whether I wanted to survive or become feed. Because the Grox did not care and the Imperium did not care, and the only person responsible for my continued existence was me. The hab blocks where workers lived were dormitories that housed 50 people each in bunks that were stacked 3 high and spaced close enough that you could hear every breath and movement of your neighbors, and the constant noise from the Grox pens was loud enough to penetrate the walls and rob us of any hope of restful sleep. Meaning we lived in a state of exhausted hyper-awareness that wore away at sanity with the same relentless pressure that water uses to carve stone. The smell was everywhere and inescapable, soaking into our clothes and our skin and our hair until we could no longer remember what clean air smelled like, and no amount of washing could remove it because the chemical compounds in Grox musk bonded with human tissue on a molecular level, and only time and cellular replacement could eliminate them, meaning we would carry the smell of the pens for months or years after we finally left this place, assuming we lived long enough to leave at all. Food came from the same industrial system that produced Grox feed and consisted primarily of processed Grox meat in various forms. Grox burgers that were compressed patties of ground meat bound with chemical additives, Grox slab that was heavily processed and could be stored indefinitely, Grox jerky that was tough enough to be used as building material, and occasionally Grox organs that had been boiled until they achieved a consistency somewhere between rubber and paste. The taste was nutritious, but came with an oily reptilian aftertaste that never washed away and made every meal feel like punishment. And after a few weeks, I stopped noticing the flavor and just shoveled food into my mouth with the mechanical efficiency of someone refueling a machine rather than nourishing a body. The medical bay was overwhelmed with a constant flow of injuries that ranged from minor cuts and bruises to catastrophic trauma that required immediate amputation or resulted in death before the medici could provide treatment. And a servo skull floated through the dormitories each evening to deliver the daily casualty report in a cheerful, mechanical voice that listed names and injury descriptions with the same tone one might use to announce mealtimes. I learned to stop paying attention to the names after the first month because knowing who had died just made the weight of survival harder to bear, and instead I focused on the statistics because numbers were abstract and could be processed without emotional engagement. 3 workers crushed by stampeding grox. 2 workers killed by breeding bulls during transfer operations. 1 worker drowned in a feed slurry tank. 5 workers hospitalized with severe respiratory damage from chemical exposure. 1 worker dead from infected wounds. These numbers became the rhythm of our lives, a drumbeat of attrition that told us every day how disposable we were and how little the Imperium cared whether we lived or died, as long as the quotas were met and the grox were fed and processed on schedule. Among the other workers, I met people who had stories similar to mine, desperate souls who had believed the propaganda and were now trapped in a nightmare with no escape except death or time. Whichever came first, Yana was a young woman from a void station who had grown up in zero gravity and should never have been assigned to agri-world work, but the Administratum's processing systems did not care about suitability and only about filling quotas. So she struggled daily with the planet's gravity and the physical demands of herding work, while maintaining a tough pragmatism that refused to acknowledge weakness or regret. She told me once that complaining changed nothing, and that the only choices we had were to work or die, and she said it without any self-pity or expectation of sympathy, because stating facts did not require emotional investment. Old Graham had lost both legs below the knee to a breeding bull during his 3rd year of service, and rather than being terminated as damaged goods, he had been reassigned to inventory management, a desk job that still required him to be present at the facility, but at least did not expose him to direct grox contact, and he spent his days tracking supply shipments and casualty reports with the meticulous attention of someone who knew that the only thing keeping him alive was his ability to demonstrate continued usefulness to the Imperium confessor. Drask was a lay preacher who had been assigned to the facility to provide spiritual support to the workers, and he conducted daily services in the dormitory common areas, leading prayers to the God Emperor and sermons about the nobility of suffering in service to the Imperium. Though sometimes, when he thought no one was listening, his prayers had a questioning quality that suggested even his faith was being tested by what he witnessed daily. The social hierarchy among workers was based entirely on survival time, with veterans like Merrick treated as minor nobility, while new arrivals like myself were considered expendable until we proved otherwise through continued existence. And this created a dynamic where knowledge and experience were hoarded rather than shared freely, because every worker who survived reduced the statistical probability of any other worker's survival. There was a black market that operated in the shadows of the dormitories, trading in illicit amasec that had been smuggled from off-world, glow sticks that provided brief chemical relief from the stress and fear, and occasionally more dangerous substances that offered temporary escape at the cost of addiction and degraded performance that usually resulted in fatal accidents within weeks of first use. I never participated in the black market trading because I understood that anything which dulled my reflexes or clouded my judgment was as dangerous as facing a grox without an electroprod. But I did not judge those who made different choices because everyone found their own ways of surviving and coping with the daily horror. And who was I to say that my method was superior when we all ended up in the same place eventually, either dead or broken or both? The propaganda vids that had brought me here felt like cruel jokes now, images from another universe where agri-worlds actually resembled the pastoral scenes they depicted, rather than industrial nightmare factories that consumed human lives as efficiently as the Grox consumed their feed, and sometimes late at night when sleep would not come. I would remember those images of golden wheat and blue skies, and wonder if such places existed anywhere in the Imperium, or if they were pure fabrications designed to lure desperate people into service that would kill them, but at least kept the machine running for one more generation. Breeding season came 4 times per standard year, and those weeks were when the already dangerous work of Grox-Herding became absolutely lethal, because breeding required the use of unlobotomized males that had retained their full cognitive function and territorial aggression, massive bulls that had each killed multiple handlers over their lifetimes, and were kept in isolation the rest of the year because putting them near any other living thing was guaranteed to result in violence. The breeding bulls were the reason why Grox were valuable despite being nearly impossible to manage, because they produced offspring with the same survival traits and meat quality that made the species useful. But those traits came packaged with predatory intelligence and rage that no amount of shock prod conditioning could fully suppress, meaning every breeding season was a calculated gamble where the Imperium decided that the potential loss of workers was acceptable in service of maintaining the livestock population. I experienced my first breeding season 3 months after arrival, after I had survived long enough to be considered something more than completely expendable, but not so long that I had any real experience with the worst that Grox could offer. And the transition from normal operations to breeding operations was marked by an increase in security protocols and protective equipment that told us better than any words that we were entering a period of elevated danger and probable casualties. The breeding bulls were kept in maximum security pens that were reinforced beyond anything used for regular stock, with walls twice as thick and electrified barriers that carried enough current to kill a human instantly. And even with these precautions, the bulls had learned to recognize the weak points in their containment and would test the barriers constantly, looking for any failure or opportunity that might allow them to break free and indulge their hatred of everything that kept them captive. The bulls themselves were larger than any lobotomized specimen, standing nearly 6 meters long and massing what must have been multiple tons of muscle and rage, wrapped in scales thick enough to resist most conventional weapons, and their eyes showed the intelligence that had been surgically removed from their castrated and lobotomized brothers, a calculating awareness that made them infinitely more dangerous because they could predict and plan and remember grudges against specific handlers who had hurt them with shock prods or herded them into situations they found offensive. The breeding process involved using electroprods and shock gates to guide a bull from its isolation pen through a series of reinforced corridors to a holding pen containing females in estrus, and every step of this process carried the risk of the bull deciding that destroying its handlers was more important than mating instincts, meaning we moved with weapons ready and multiple backup teams positioned to intervene if something went wrong, which it often did. During my first breeding operation, a worker named Petra was caught between 2 fighting bulls that had both been released into the same female pen due to a timing error in the gate sequence, and the bulls in their rage and territorial competition did not distinguish between each other and the humans trying to separate them. And Petra was caught in that chaos and crushed so thoroughly that her body could not be recovered intact, but instead had to be scraped up in pieces and processed along with the day's normal feed production. I was assigned to the cleanup crew that had to remove the remains and sanitize the pen for continued use, and the smell of human blood mixing with Grox, musk, and chemical cleaners created a sensory memory that I knew would haunt me for however long I managed to survive. And the worst part was not the horror of what had happened, but the cold efficiency with which it was processed, Petra's death recorded in a ledger as acceptable operational loss, while her body was fed back to the creatures that had killed her, because the Imperium wastes nothing, and human protein has the same nutritional value as any other organic matter. The sounds during breeding season were beyond anything I'd experienced during normal operations, a constant symphony of bellowing and roaring, and the impacts of multi-ton bodies colliding as bulls fought for dominance even while mating. And these sounds continued through the night because Grox breeding was not subject to human notions of rest or appropriate hours. Meaning we worked in rotating shifts that kept handlers on duty 24 hours a day, and sleep became something that happened in brief moments of collapse rather than in scheduled rest periods. I vomited several times during that first breeding season, my body's response to stress and exhaustion and the constant assault of sensory horror that exceeded what my nervous system had been designed to process. And I was not alone in this, because even experienced handlers showed signs of strain that manifested in shaking hands and 1,000-meter stares and the haunted quality that comes from seeing things that human minds are not equipped to witness and survive undamaged. The processing plant was a section of the facility I'd not visited during my first months of work. But eventually my rotation schedule assigned me temporary duty on the kill floor, and that experience taught me that however horrific I thought the living Grox were, their death was somehow worse in ways that went beyond simple physical disgust and touched on something philosophical about the nature of industrial-scale violence and the way the Imperium transformed all life into resources without acknowledging the transition. The processing plant operated 24 hours a day with the mechanical efficiency of any industrial operation, and thousands of Grox were slaughtered daily. Their bodies transformed from living creatures into packaged meat products through a series of automated and semi-automated steps that had been refined over centuries to achieve maximum efficiency and minimum waste. The Grox came in through intake chutes that connected directly to the transport pens, and they moved forward in single file through corridors that funneled them toward the stun station, where automated hammers delivered precise strikes to their skulls that were calculated to render them unconscious without killing them, because conscious but immobilized, Grox bled better and produced higher quality meat. The hammers fell with mechanical repetition that never slowed and never missed, each impact producing a sound that was somewhere between a crack and a wet thud, and the Grox would drop without vocalization because the brainstem damage prevented any final cry, and they would slide forward on conveyor systems that moved them to the next station, where mechanical cleavers opened their throats and let gravity and hydraulics drain them of blood that was collected in tanks for later processing into fertilizer and chemical feedstock. The bodies moved through stations where automated saws removed heads and limbs with precision that would have been impressive if it had not been applied to living creatures that had been conscious seconds before. And then the torsos went to flaying stations where mechanical arms stripped away the scales and skin in sheets that would later be treated and turned into leather goods, and then to butchering stations where massive cleavers divided the carcasses into primary cuts that would be further processed or packaged, depending on quality grades that were determined by sensors that measured fat content and muscle density. The efficiency was horrible to witness because it made death seem routine and insignificant, just another step in a manufacturing process that happened to use living things as raw materials, and I understood in a way that I had not before why the Imperium treated human workers with the same cold pragmatism, because once you have systematized death on this scale, once you have reduced living things to components in a machine, the distinction between Grox and human becomes purely a matter of which provides better return on investment. The workers in the processing plant were mostly servitors, lobotomized humans who had been converted into biological machines through surgery and augmentation that destroyed their personality and consciousness and left only enough brain function to follow simple commands and operate equipment, and seeing them work with their blank faces and mechanical movements was a daily reminder of what awaited anyone who failed to serve the Imperium with sufficient enthusiasm or who committed crimes serious enough to warrant conversion, but not serious enough to justify simple execution. There were a few human overseers who monitored the servitors, and handled problems that required judgment or adaptability, and these overseers moved through the facility with the exhausted indifference of people who had seen too much death to react to it emotionally anymore. And I wondered if that was my future, assuming I survived long enough. That gradual erosion of empathy and horror until I became as mechanical as the servitors around me, operating on pure routine without any connection to the meaning of what I was doing. During my time on the kill floor, there was a malfunction where a Grox woke up from the stun hammer before reaching the bleeding station, and the creature came awake on the conveyor belt with full awareness and massive pain from the skull fracture that had failed to achieve its purpose, and it began to thrash and bellow with an intensity that shook the entire processing line. And because it was still mobile and aware, it became a massive problem that required immediate solution before it damaged equipment or caused a cascade failure in the automated systems. The solution involved 3 servitors who moved in with restraint protocols, while 2 human overseers fired shock prods that were rated for breeding bulls, and even then it took several minutes to bring the Grox under control. During that time, it managed to destroy 3 servitors whose bodies were simply pushed aside as damaged equipment while the line continued operating. And it killed 2 human overseers by catching them with its tail and crushing them against the machinery. And I watched all of this happen from my position at a secondary station, and understood that the only reason I was not involved was random chance, rather than any skill or value I possessed, and that tomorrow or next week or next month I might be the one caught in the wrong place when something went wrong, and becoming another casualty recorded in a ledger before being fed back into the system. The line restarted within minutes of the Grox being finally killed, and the bodies of the human overseers were removed to be processed separately from the Grox carcasses, but ultimately going to the same destination. And the damaged servitors were dragged to maintenance for evaluation and potential repair or scrapping, depending on cost analysis. And within an hour, the incident had been completely absorbed into the routine of normal operations as if it had never happened. And that ability of the system to continue operating regardless of failures or casualties was perhaps more frightening than any individual moment of violence, because it demonstrated the futility of resistance or hope or any belief that individual lives mattered to the greater machine we served. The tithe inspection happened every standard quarter, when representatives from the administratum arrived to assess production quotas and verify that the facility was meeting its obligations to the Imperium. And these inspections were events that transformed the already tense atmosphere of the facility into something approaching panic, because falling short of quotas meant punishment that ranged from ration reductions to executions, depending on the severity of the shortfall and the mood of the inspectors. The preparations for inspection began weeks in advance, with workers assigned to cleaning and cosmetic repairs that would make the visible areas of the facility look properly maintained and efficient. And we were drilled on proper responses to potential questions, taught to express gratitude for the opportunity to serve the God Emperor through our labor, and to deny any complaints or concerns we might have about working conditions or safety procedures. The actual inspection was conducted by a man whose title was Tithe Master Secundus, and whose face had the kind of hard efficiency that comes from years of reducing human lives to numbers in reports. And he moved through the facility with a coterie of scribes and servitors who recorded everything they observed in data slates that would be compiled into assessments that determined the facility's continued operation and our own continued survival. The Tithe Master spent minimal time examining the actual Grox operations because he was not interested in methodology, but only in results. And his scribes compared our production numbers against the established quotas with the kind of meticulous attention that people reserve for finding discrepancies they can exploit. And eventually they found what they were looking for in a 3% shortfall in processed meat production that had resulted from a disease outbreak in one of the breeding populations 2 months prior. The disease had killed hundreds of Grox before being contained through culling and chemical treatment, and the losses had been reported through proper channels and logged according to protocol, but the quota system did not adjust for such variables because the Imperium's needs remained constant. regardless of local circumstances, and therefore the shortfall was treated not as an unfortunate situation, but as a failure that required correction and punishment. The tithe master announced without any change in his emotionless tone that rations for all facility workers would be reduced by 15% until the production deficit was eliminated, and that work shifts would be extended by 2 hours per day to increase throughput, and that these measures would continue for the next standard quarter regardless of whether the quota was met earlier, because punishment served not just to correct current failures, but to discourage future failures through the lesson of suffering. Then, in what seemed like an afterthought, but was actually the main purpose of his visit, the tithe master ordered Overseer Calyx to execute one worker publicly as an example of what happened to those responsible for sabotage and inefficiency. And it did not matter that there had been no sabotage and that the disease outbreak had been beyond anyone's control, because the Imperium required a visible demonstration of consequence, and someone needed to be selected to serve that function. The worker chosen was a man I did not know well, someone who had arrived in a different intake group and worked a different section of the facility, and he was dragged to the central yard where all workers had been assembled and shot through the head with a bolt pistol that exploded his skull in a spray of bone and brain matter that painted the ground with the red proof that the Imperium's will was absolute and resistance was futile. We were made to stand and watch this execution without any possibility of turning away or closing our eyes, because witnessing was part of the punishment, and afterward we returned to our duties with the knowledge that we were all equally expendable, and that the system we served viewed our deaths as acceptable costs as long as the quotas were met, and the tithe was paid on schedule. That night in the dormitory, I lay in my bunk and listened to the constant bellowing of the Grox and wondered if this was truly the Emperor's will, or if it was just the machinery of human cruelty dressed in religious justification. But such thoughts were dangerous and had to be pushed away before they took root and grew into the kind of questioning that led to suspicion and accusation, and ending up as the next example in the next tithe inspection. The disease that swept through the Grox population during my 6th month at the facility started as scattered reports of behavioral changes in certain pens, animals that were more sluggish than normal or showed unusual aggression even for Grox standards, and initially these reports were dismissed as normal variation or handling errors until the symptoms progressed to the point where they could not be ignored. The infected Grox developed boils across their bodies that ruptured and leaked fluids that carried the infection to other animals through contact or airborne transmission, and they bled from their mouths and nostrils and other orifices in quantities that should have killed them, but instead just seemed to increase their pain and rage, and their hyper-aggression made them attack anything near them, including other Grox, which accelerated the spread of the disease through violence and the mixing of infected blood with open wounds. Within 2 weeks, hundreds of Grox were showing symptoms, and within a month, the death toll had reached thousands as the disease moved through the pens with the efficiency of any virulent plague. And the facility's response was to accelerate culling operations to prevent the complete loss of all stock, which meant slaughtering infected animals as fast as they could be identified and burning the carcasses in massive bonfires that consumed flesh and bone and released smoke that added new layers of toxicity to the already poisoned air. The cause of the outbreak was eventually traced to contaminated feed that had been shipped from another agri-world where similar problems were occurring. And this revelation did nothing to help us because the feed had already been consumed and the disease had already spread and the damage was done. But it did result in angry communications between facility overseers and the administratum offices responsible for supply chain management, angry communications that resolved nothing and changed nothing, but at least allowed someone to feel like they were taking action, even if that action was purely performative. Workers were drafted into the pens to remove dead Grox carcasses, which was among the most dangerous work possible because the pens still contained living Grox, both infected and healthy, and all of them were in heightened states of aggression from the stress and smell of death. And this meant that body removal became a military operation, with armed guards providing covering fire, while work crews used lifting equipment to drag multi-ton corpses toward transport vehicles that would take them to the burning sites. Yana was gored during one of these operations when an infected bull charged the work crew and its horn caught her in the side, tearing through the protective coat she wore and opening a wound that was not immediately fatal but required urgent medical attention to prevent blood loss or infection. And I was close enough to grab her and drag her away from the bull before it could finish what it started. And I got her to the medical bay where the overworked medici stitched her wound and pumped her full of antibiotics and kept her under observation for 3 days to ensure she did not develop sepsis. She survived, but the wound left a scar that ran from her ribs to her hip, and the psychological impact was worse than the physical damage because she had looked into the eyes of that bull as it charged and seen the hatred there, not animal instinct but conscious malevolence. And that knowledge that we were being killed by creatures that understood what they were doing and took satisfaction from it was harder to process than simple accidents or random violence. The massive bonfires of Grox's corpse burned continuously for weeks, their smoke visible from anywhere in the facility and adding a smell of charred meat to the already overwhelming stench of living Grox. And the combination created an atmosphere that was beyond toxic and moved into actively harmful, with workers developing respiratory problems from breathing air that was thick with burning flesh particles and chemical smoke from treated hides, and the general miasma of death on an industrial scale. Several workers died from toxic smoke inhalation before breathing masks were distributed more widely, and even with masks, the air quality was bad enough that we could feel our lungs burning with every breath, and old injuries and existing respiratory damage were aggravated to the point where some workers simply could not continue functioning and collapsed during shifts and had to be carried to the medical bay, or in worse cases, simply left where they fell, because the work had to continue regardless of individual casualties. The administration's response to the crisis was to increase work hours and reduce rations, supposedly to cover the costs of disease containment and replacement stock, though the real reason was probably that they saw an opportunity to extract more productivity from workers who were too exhausted and demoralized to resist, and this meant we were working 16-hour shifts on reduced food in an atmosphere that was actively poisonous while handling creatures that were dying in ways that made them even more dangerous than usual. And the casualty rate during this period was higher than any other time in the facility's recorded history, with an average of 5 workers dying every day and twice that number being injured seriously enough to require medical attention or reassignment. The whispered conversations about escape started in the dormitories during the disease outbreak. Quiet discussions held in corners where the surveillance servitors might not hear and where the risk of being overheard by informants was minimized, though never eliminated. And these conversations were born from the desperation of people who had reached their breaking point and were willing to consider options that would normally be dismissed as suicidal because continuing as things were seemed only marginally less likely to result in death, and at least escape offered the possibility of death on your own terms, rather than crushed under a Grox or worked to death by administrative decree. The participants in these discussions included myself and Yana and 3 other workers, whose names I will not record here because some survived and some did not. And naming them serves no purpose except to create additional risk. And after initial conversations, we were surprised to find that Confessor Drask had not only overheard us, but wanted to participate, which was shocking because as a representative of the ecclesiarchy, he should have been reporting such heretical talk rather than engaging with it. Drask's participation came with a confession that his faith was being tested by what he witnessed daily at the facility, that he had begun to question whether the suffering we endured truly served the God Emperor's vision or if it was simply the product of human greed and bureaucratic indifference dressed in religious justification. And he said that if the Emperor truly wanted humanity to suffer, then perhaps the Emperor's vision was not worth serving, which was heresy so profound that merely hearing it should have prompted me to report him to the authorities, except that I found myself agreeing with the sentiment and wondering if I had ever truly believed in the imperial truth, or if I had just been repeating the propaganda fed to us since childhood. The plan that emerged from our discussions was simple in concept but dangerous in execution. We would wait until the next supply ship arrived at the facility's primary spaceport, then use stolen identification badges and forged credentials to infiltrate the loading operations and smuggle ourselves aboard a transport that was leaving the planet, hiding among the cargo until we reached whatever destination the ship was bound for, and then disappearing into whatever population existed there and hoping that the Imperium's bureaucracy was inefficient enough that we could avoid being tracked and terminated. Yana's background as a void station tech gave us confidence that she could operate a small craft if we managed to steal one, and Drask's status as a confessor might provide cover for our movements because religious personnel were given wider latitude in their movements than regular workers, and my own contributions were minimal except that I was young and desperate and willing to risk everything because the alternative was continuing at the facility until I died from accident or exhaustion or simple despair. The night we chose for our attempt was during the arrival of a major supply ship that was bringing replacement feedstocks and equipment, and we had stolen ID badges from dead workers whose bodies had not yet been processed and whose biometric data was still registered in the facility's access systems, and we had studied the layout of the restricted areas using old maintenance documents that Grem had access to through his inventory management position. And we waited until the shift change when confusion and reduced supervision created a window of opportunity that might last only minutes, but was the best we would get. The escape attempt began well enough that I allowed myself to believe we might actually succeed, which was a mistake because hope is dangerous when it creates expectations that reality then crushes with casual brutality. We used our stolen badges to pass through the first checkpoint without challenge, the automated systems accepting our credentials without triggering any alarms, and we moved through the restricted corridors with the confident stride of workers who belonged there and were performing authorized duties, and the few human overseers we encountered gave us only cursory glances before returning to their own tasks. Because we had done nothing yet to draw suspicion, the perimeter fence of the Grox complex was our first major obstacle, a barrier that was designed to keep Grox contained but also served to restrict worker movement. And we had planned to cut through a section that was hidden from direct observation by a processing building using industrial cutters that Yana had stolen from a maintenance locker. The fence itself was not the problem, as the cutters made short work of the wire mesh and we were through in less than a minute. But crossing that boundary triggered some sensor system that we had not accounted for, and within seconds, klaxons were blaring across the facility and searchlights were swiveling to scan the perimeter. Our group made the decision in that moment to split up, with 3 of us heading directly for the spaceport, while the others created distractions by running in different directions, and the logic was that at least some of us might reach the transport if the enforcers had to divide their attention. But this meant abandoning people to certain capture or death, and making that choice felt like betraying everything that connected us as humans, rather than simply components in a machine I ran with Yana and Drask across open ground that offered no cover and little concealment, and behind us we could hear the sounds of pursuit, mixed with something else that I realized with horror was the sound of Grox pens being opened, and someone in the facility's command structure had made the decision to release some of the livestock as a method of crowd control or simply as punishment for our attempted escape. And this turned the already dangerous situation into something approaching suicidal because now we were being chased not just by enforcers, but by predatory reptiles that had no reason to distinguish between authorized personnel and escaping workers and would kill anything they encountered. The gambit worked in one sense because the freed Grox did create chaos that slowed the organized pursuit, but it also meant that the landscape we were trying to cross was now populated with massive, aggressive predators that could move faster than humans and had no reason to show mercy or restraint. We made it to the fence line that separated the Grox complex from the spaceport facility, and we could see the lights of landing pads and parked transports less than a kilometer away, close enough to reach in minutes if we were not being pursued by both humans and monsters. The final approach required crossing an open area that was monitored by automated gun servitors that were designed to prevent unauthorized access to the spaceport, and we had hoped that in the confusion of the alarm our approach might go unnoticed, but instead the servitors acquired us as targets and opened fire with heavy stubbers that chewed up the ground around us and forced us to scatter and seek whatever cover we could find in terrain that offered almost nothing except shallow depressions and the occasional piece of abandoned equipment. Drask was hit in the leg by stubber rounds that shattered his femur and left him unable to walk, and he screamed at us to keep going while he provided covering fire with an electro-prod he had been carrying, which was useless against the servitors, but might slow human enforcers if they got close, and Yana and I made the decision to leave him behind, because stopping would mean all of us dying instead of just one, and I will never forget the look on his face as we ran past him toward the spaceport. A mixture of fear and resignation, and something that might have been relief that at least some of us might make it even if he would not. The Arbit's enforcers caught us at the gate to the spaceport, surrounding us with weapons drawn and servo skulls hovering overhead to record everything for administrative review and possible prosecution, and we surrendered because the alternative was being shot down where we stood. And in that moment of defeat, I felt something inside me break that had nothing to do with physical injury and everything to do with the realization that we had never had a real chance of escape, and that the entire attempt had been nothing more than a futile gesture against a system that was designed to prevent exactly this kind of resistance. They brought us back to the facility and assembled all the workers in the central yard to witness our punishment, and Overseer Calix arrived personally to preside over what he announced would be an important lesson about the consequences of violating the Imperium's laws and attempting to abandon sacred duty. The other members of our escape group had been captured or killed during their flight, and their bodies were displayed as additional examples of what awaited those who chose to resist, and I recognized faces that I had known and worked beside and shared meals with, and now they were just corpses, arranged for maximum visual impact to ensure that the message was received by everyone watching. Calix delivered a speech about duty and service and the proper place of workers in the imperial hierarchy, and his mechanical voice carried across the yard with perfect clarity despite the ongoing noise from the Grox pens, and he explained with the same clinical detachment he used for everything that we had been recruited not as farmers but as expendable labor, that the average lifespan of a Grox-Herder was 3.7 years, which meant the facility went through approximately 50,000 workers annually, and that the propaganda vids shown in the underhives were specifically designed to lure desperate people into volunteering because voluntary recruitment was more efficient than forced conscription, even if the end result was identical. He revealed these facts without any apparent recognition that they might be horrifying or unjust, stating them as simple operational parameters, the way one might describe the specifications of a machine. And I understood in that moment that to him and to the Imperium he represented, we truly were nothing more than components in a system, our lives measured not in years or our experiences, but in productivity metrics and replacement costs. The sentence for our escape attempt was delivery to the breeding pens as what Calix termed motivational examples, which meant we would be locked in with unlobotomized breeding bulls that had been specifically agitated to increase their aggression, and that our deaths would be recorded and broadcast throughout the facility to ensure that all workers understood the price of resistance. Yana and I were stripped of our protective equipment and given no weapons or means of defense, and we were marched to one of the maximum security breeding pens that held 3 massive bulls that had been starved for 2 days to increase their irritability, and as the gate closed behind us, I reached for Yana's hand, and she gripped it with desperate strength, and we stood together in the center of that pen while the bulls circled and evaluated us with the intelligence of predators that understood exactly what was about to happen. The pain was beyond anything I had imagined possible when the first bull charged, and its massive head caught me in the chest with enough force to shatter my ribs and send me flying backward into the wall of the pen, and the impact drove the air from my lungs and left me gasping while my nervous system tried to process damage that exceeded its ability to relay information through normal channels. Yana screamed, but the sound was cut short as the second bull seized her in its jaws and shook her the way a terrier shakes a rat. And I could hear bones breaking with sounds like green wood snapping, and part of my mind observed this with clinical detachment while another part screamed in horror and rage and absolute despair. The third bull reached me before I could regain my feet, and its claws tore through the flesh of my legs and opened wounds that were immediately catastrophic, blood flowing in quantities that meant I had minutes at most before blood loss rendered me unconscious and then dead. I tried to pray to the Emperor for salvation, or at least a quick death, but the words would not come because I no longer believed that the Emperor cared about what happened to people like me. And if he did care, then his vision for humanity was so alien and terrible that worship seemed obscene rather than righteous. The pain began to fade as shock and blood loss did their work, and the last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was the face of Overseer Calix watching from outside the pen, his mechanical eyes recording everything with perfect clarity for inclusion in reports that would document our deaths as acceptable losses in service of production quotas and imperial efficiency. I wondered if anyone beyond this facility would ever know what happened here, if our deaths would mean anything beyond numbers in a ledger. And then I wondered nothing at all as the darkness took me, and the Grox continued their work of reducing human flesh to components that would be processed and fed back into the system because the Imperium wastes nothing, and the machine must be fed regardless of the cost in blood and suffering and souls that cry out for mercy that never comes. 6 months after my death, a new batch of recruits arrived on Torvandis 7, transported from various underhives and industrial worlds across the sector by the same propaganda and desperate hope that had brought me here, and among them was a young man named Micah, who had watched the same recruitment vidcards I had watched and believed the same lies I had believed, because desperate people will cling to any hope, no matter how obviously false, when the alternative is accepting that their current circumstances are all they will ever know. He stepped off the transport and smelled the air for the first time and saw the yellow-gray sky and felt the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on him, and an old worker with missing fingers and scars that told stories of survival against impossible odds approached him and whispered a warning that was meant to be kindness, even though it came too late to change anything. The worker told him to run while he still could, told him that this place was not a farm but a prison, told him that everyone who came here died eventually, and that the only variable was how long it took and how much suffering you endured before the end. And Micah listened with the incomprehension of someone who had not yet experienced enough to understand what the warning really meant. In the distance, the Grox bellowed in their endless hunger, and above the main gate someone had painted a sign that read, "In service to the God Emperor, we feed the Imperium's billions." And below it, in crude scratching that the administration had not yet bothered to remove some previous worker, had added, "We are the meat." The overseer called for the new recruits to line up for processing, and Micah fell into formation with the others, and the great machine of the Imperium ground forward, powered by blood and sweat and the suffering of billions who had no choice but to serve or die. And sometimes both, because there is only war and someone must feed those who fight it, and if the price is measured in human lives consumed as efficiently as the Grox consume their feed, then that is simply the cost of survival in a galaxy that knows no mercy and offers no redemption, and the only truth that matters is that the machine must be fed, and the tithe must be paid, and the Emperor's work continues regardless of how many souls are crushed beneath its wheels, as it grinds forward through the darkness toward a future that may never come, but that we are all sacrificed to maintain through our labor and our deaths and our absolute insignificance in a system that measures worth in production quotas rather than human value.